I've been here 1,000 times. It's all a big hustle and a serious crime. You're coming out to me and hope I come quietly. Already in love, but nowhere to call my home. You're still a part of me.
So many places, I've seen them all with open eyes. Seen islands, open spaces, staring at the sun slowly rise. All these memories, I hold them near me when I sail the Aegean Sea. But there's one place for me. are filled with people I used to race back home from school. We kids, we never back down. We learn by breaking every rule. Ooh, all these memories. Take me to the place where I come from. The only place that I really belong. Oh, sometimes this road can be so long. Back to you. Ooh. Sun is rising. I can see the edge of the horizon way out there. One day, maybe I will get to see it rise with you. Take me to the place where I come from. The only place that I really belong. Oh, sometimes this road can be so long. Back to you. Ooh. Back to you. Ooh.
I shut the door and all the windows I hide inside. Forget the people I used to love. All that I had. Open the drawers, try to find something new to last. And the time rushing by so fast. All that I had. All the times we would run off, get in trouble.
trouble could have held on to that bubble, and I would get to you, you would get me too. But now we've fallen through. If we only could make it last till the end of time in a flash. We were over before I could get to you. You already knew we were overdue. Make it last till the end of time in a flash. We were over before I could get to you. You already knew we were overdue. Make it last.
Can we stay here for a week or so? Just watch the corn grow in the fields. I don't know what's on your mind, but I know that it's something about you and me. I'll stay here for as long as I can, through the storms and through the calm. When you smile at me, I slowly began to realize that you are the one. But I will sneak a note in your pocket, and I'll leave with your smile in my mind. Wherever we will end up, I will love it. 'Cause you're mine, 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 mine. And you know I'll walk a million miles for you. You said summer will be over soon. Would you still like to hang around? When clouds roll in and cover the moon, will we manage to stand the ground? Without you, I'm an only tree, cold, naked, lost in faith. And what's an island without a sea? For you, I'll hold the wave. But I will sneak a note in your pocket, and I'll leave with your smile in my mind. Wherever talking in my sleep. I'm waking up like every night, just to escape my vivid dreams. Last night I called your name, but you were nowhere found. Your picture in a frame from when you were around. The memories haunting me, and it's my destiny. Baby, tell me why you're still here on my mind. If only these words could speak right to your heart. Tell me, is it too late to rewind and restart? Baby, your love and my love has drifted too far, but I keep on missing you. Girl, I keep on missing you. Yeah. Do you think of me sometimes? How we failed each time we tried, but now and then it was so good. Those were the best days of our lives. Last night I called your name, but you were nowhere found. Your picture in a frame from when you were around. The memories haunting me, and it's my destiny. Baby, tell me why you're still here on my mind. If only his words could speak right to your heart. Tell me, is it too late to rewind and restart? Baby, your love and my love has drifted
fade. In a single second, every color turns to gray. You're the color in my life. This time everything feels right. Will we always feel the fire in our beating hearts? I sure hope so, even if we have been miles apart. Feels like half my body moves somewhere distant beyond the stars. Here in the sunset, you and me should be together in silence. To be near you is a kind of enlightenment. Wherever we go from here, this is destruction. I just miss you too much to fully function. It's a state I kinda hate, but you'll return, and we'll never be alone again. I'm calling right now, but you're probably empty. Those crying baby, I'm this is destruction. I just miss you too much to fully function. It's a state I kinda hate, but you'll return, and we'll never be alone again.
I know you're trying your best to hold on to what you believe in, what makes you strong. Mirrors are lying and pictures can be fake. I know you better than anyone else. Got this feeling lately that you are drowning maybe, but all the world is crazy, they don't know a thing. One love, that's all you need to be everything you wanna be. All the love you'll ever need is waiting right here. Don't hit the wall, just learn to save weight. You're truly special, no matter what they say. When life is cruel, that's every night to me. I think of you, is that so hard to see? Got this feeling lately that you are drowning maybe, but all the world is crazy, they don't know a thing. One love, that's all you need to be everything you wanna be. All the love you'll ever need is waiting right here. One love, that's all you need to be everything you wanna be. All the love you'll ever need is waiting right here. I didn't come here to save you. I think we need each other. But if I could, I would save you, and you'll still wonder. One love, that's all you need to be everything you want to be. And all that love is standing right here. One love, that's all you need to be everything you wanna be. All the love you'll ever need is waiting right here.
scars to prove it. Of all the setbacks in your life, you don't know how to do it and how you're gonna stay alive. Is this the life you've chosen? Like everything that's broken are falling into pieces. Oh, they're falling into pieces. Your building walls surround you. For every brick that you lay down, who will see you when you become the alien? For the things that bound you and every obstacle around, you take the easy way out. The building walls surround you. Whoa. Every time you fall and stumble, you wanna be set free from your chains. And when it all starts to crumble and fall into pieces, yeah, they're falling into pieces. Your building walls surround you. For every brick that you lay down, who will see you when you become the alien? For the things that bound you and every obstacle around, you take the easy way out. The building walls surround you. Oh, I'm afraid that there is no one who catch you when you fall down. But how will you know unless you let yourself fall? You let yourself fall. Your building walls surround you. For every brick that you lay down, who will see you when you become the alien? And for all the things that bound you and every obstacle around, you take the easy way out. The building walls surround you. The building walls surround you. For every brick that you lay down, who will see you when you become the alien? For the things that bound you and every obstacle around, take the easy way out. The building walls surround you. Oh.
Saw you there by the counter, looking flash. Thought I'd walk up to you. I was out with my buddies, talking trash with nothing to do. I got up from the table, adrenaline started walking to you. If ever I would be able to feel your skin and be close to you, I could levitate, figure it, bring back the dead. But now I'm just in my head. I'll fight to get through to you, and I think you would want me to. I'll try to survive, just acting cool. Make you swoon, yeah, break all the rules, and I'll say goodbye to being shy. I will stand up a warrior, and I'll win your heart, create the art. Man, I'm feeling so out there, about to crack as I'm coming up closer to you. I can't find nothing but doubt there in my head, but I'll talk to you. Looking back on it someday, maybe I'll just laugh with you at the memory. And now it's fall on Monday, I'm about to die, 'cause you're blinding me. Hey, I could wait, I could go back to my place, but maybe you like me so I'll fight to get through to you. And I think you would want me to. I'll try to survive, just acting cool. Make you swoon, yeah, break all the rules. And I'll say goodbye to being shy. I will stand up a warrior. I'll win your heart, create the art of a bigger love, bigger love. Get through to you, and I think you would want me to. I'll try to survive, just acting cool. Make you swoon, yeah, break all the rules. And I'll say goodbye to being shy. I will stand up a warrior. I'll win your heart, create the art of a bigger love.
Outside will dig and drill. When you try to wake up, but your eyes won't cope, it's a shame they got their own ways. Will you dance with me for a second time? I will try to make you stay. With a smile you got me hooked. Till your body breaks. you. Do you know I really like you? I won't let you go by now, not until it's safe and sound. Honey, I like to know if I'm the only one you want, and you know why. This life is a lottery, nothing ever comes for free. Just know that if we're together, then forever will be beautiful. I wanna be with you and resting here forever in your arms. I've kept my heart inside a box, threw away the key. You found your way under my skin, now I come undone. The walls that I built on weakest paper, my castle is falling from the sky. Ain't nobody else have made me lose my grip before. Yeah, I come undone. Was fast asleep both night and day, now I'm wide awake. My world is turning all upside down. Oh, I come undone. The walls that I built on weakest paper, my castle is falling from the sky. Ain't nobody else have made me lose my grip before. Yeah, I come undone. Oh, yeah. Will you catch my fall? Or will you carry me home? 'Cause I can't hold on, gotta let myself go for you. Can you show me how? Can I learn to be free? Oh, 'cause I'm too afraid, but there's no turning back from here. Hope you remain right next to me as days turns to years. Say, can you hear the bells singing our song as I come undone? The walls that I built on weakest paper, my castle is falling from the sky. Ain't nobody else have made me lose my grip before. Yeah, I come undone. Ooh, oh, I come undone.
long as I got you. I was running from myself those days, always breathless, search for something safe. And then I smashed into that golden face. And for the first time, I don't run away. We danced together till we got it right. Ups and downs through many days and nights. You appeared to be my guiding light. And at the same time, I realized, oh baby, when you hold me, I rather lost my senses than be lonely. 'Cause baby, when you touch me, I feel holy. Oh, nothing in the world will kill me as long as I got you. Oh baby, as long as I got you. Oh baby, baby, as long as you want me to. As long as I got you, you. As long as I got you. We faced the dark like if we weren't scared, close to each other's backs without no fear. Hold on and waited for the sun to appear. 'Cause in the nighttime, I'm by your side. Oh baby, when you hold me, I rather lost my senses than be lonely. 'Cause baby, when you touch me, I feel holy. Oh, nothing in the world will kill me as long as I got you. Oh baby, as long as I got you. Oh baby, baby, as long as you want me to. As long as I got you. As long as I got you. I'm done with embrace, I'm done with ache, 'cause I'm done with fake. As long as I got you. I'm done with embrace, I'm done with ache, 'cause I'm done with fake. Oh baby, when you hold me, I rather lost my senses than be lonely. 'Cause baby, when you touch me, I feel holy. Oh, nothing in the world will kill me as long as I got you. I'm done with embrace. Oh baby, as long as I got you. 'Cause I'm done with baby, baby, as long as you want me to. I'm done with embrace. As long as I got you. As long as I got you.
I know I've told you 1,000 times before, and yeah, I know I have let you down. But I wouldn't try if I didn't think that I could be a better man. I just need you to be around. I just can't stand the thought of being on my own, left alone, honey, without you. All the hopes and places we've been dreaming of, I just can't let them go. So please, please don't leave. I'm begging you not to go. Oh, please, please don't go. Please know we've been through this 1,000 times before. I always think we'll get up again. Oh, we've had days and days when life's been beautiful, and I just know I can't let them go. No. Oh, please, please don't leave. I'm begging you not to go. Oh, please, please don't go. Please don't. Oh, please, please don't leave. I'm begging
This is suddenly. Hiding in the bungalow, she felt so young. The night she was much younger than the other. Feeling like a prisoner there in the light. She stood, she knew they couldn't miss her. And then they took her as her, walked her red flame. You wrote to me, you wrote to me. This is suddenly. Sad for her, but an order is an order. She was a prisoner there in the light. She stood, but she knew they couldn't break her. And by the shore, the bombs were falling with the snow. You wrote to me, you wrote to me. This is Annalie.
To show me my way in. The only point I reach is frustration. And then back again, then back again. Trying to see why I had to lie in. Go around the moon with your heart in. Then back again, then back again. Hey, draw your arrow back. I want you to fly me into the sky. I'll fall but never crack. Are you dreaming of love too? Or are you still in your shadow? I know I didn't see the good between us, but tell you what, I've opened up my eyes and seen the truth, so you can blame it on my youth. Courage, no one seems to care that I lost it. You're the only one that's gonna tell me to go back again, give it one more chance. Blame it, one day I will see what it cost me. You're the only one that always trusted me, and that's all I need, my remedy. Hey, yeah, draw your arrow back. I just want you to fly me into the sky of all the never cracks. Are you dreaming of love soon, or are you still in your shadow? I know I didn't see the good between us, yeah. I tell you what, I've opened up my eyes and seen, I've opened up my eyes and seen the truth. What have I to lose? I tell you what, I've opened up my eyes and seen the truth. Why don't you blame it on my youth? Are you dreaming of love soon, or are you still in your shadow? Are you dreaming of love soon, or are you still in your shadow? I know I didn't see the good between us, yeah. So tell you what, I've opened up my eyes and seen the truth. Why don't you blame it on my youth?
Hey, pretty baby. Oh, yeah. Alright, listen. I've been waiting for so long, girl, yeah, to be with you alone, girl, yeah, yeah. Move your back against the wall, girl, don't be afraid, won't let you fall, girl, no, no, no. You don't have to feel no pressure. We got all the night, no stress, girl. Go ahead and get undressed, girl. We can do it all the night, and I promise you I will make you scream my name. I know you make me do the same, girl. I will make you scream my name. I know you make me do the same, baby. Make me scream your name. I will make you scream my name. I know you make me do the same, girl. I will make you scream my name. I know you make me do the same, baby. Make me scream your name. Oh baby, please don't stop. No, we'll take it to the top, girl, yeah, yeah. We can do it all night long, just me and you alone. Oh baby, you're so beautiful, beautiful. You don't have to feel no pressure. We got all the night, no stress, girl. Go ahead and get undressed, girl. We can do it all the night, and I promise you that my name, I know you make me do the same, girl. I will make you scream my name. I know you make me do the same, baby. Make me scream your name. I will make you scream my name. I know you make
not where we used to be. Tell me again what you feel. I can't believe this is real. Hearts can be broken, but this is absurd. I'm getting crushed by the weight of your words. Tell me again how this works. I'm in love, but it hurts. Hearts can be broken, but this is absurd. I'm getting crushed by the weight of your words. Tell me again what you feel. I can't believe this is real. Hearts can be broken, but this is absurd. I'm getting crushed by the weight of your words. The wind is playing with your hair. I'm watching it painting circles in the air. You're smiling at me like only you could do. Like a perfect dream, and that dream is you. The sun is lighting up your face. We stayed up all night and listened to the rain. Like music kept on playing like a drum. With you in my arms, I'm the lucky one. And I wanna spend the day making love 1,000 ways and more to show. Baby, every time we're kissing, I know it is forbidden, but I can't stop. No, I can't stop. Your body's on my body, I know you really got me, 'cause I can't stop. No, I can't stop. Even if I'm trying, I could never pull away. And when we are, but I can't stop. No, I can't stop. When we are, girl, I can't stop. No, I can't stop. When people telling her to leave, that she won't have a future here with me. Though I've done my best, I've tried to prove them wrong. They ain't listening, but I know that she's the one. And I wanna spend the day, make love 1,000 ways and more to show. Baby, every time we're kissing, I know it is forbidden, but I can't stop. No, I can't stop. Your body's on my body, I know you really got me, 'cause I can't stop. No, I can't stop. Even if I'm trying, I could never pull away. And when we are, girl, I can't stop. No, I can't stop. When we are, girl, I can't stop. No, I can't stop. Can't stop. Can't stop now. Can't stop. Can't stop now. The sun is lighting up your face. We stayed up all night and listened to the rain. Like music it kept on playing like a drum. I'm the lucky one. Everything can break, it's a risk you take. I went out on a limb, but I fell down. It was my mistake.
thought that you would wait. You should know that it hurt me to leave town. I heard you found a new friend who's an old good friend of mine. My heart, it beats like a drum. Let it drum just to numb my mind. It should have been me. I hope you can see. I wish I was there with you tonight, but I should let go a long time ago. But I just keep going back in time. Now that it's all too late, I shouldn't have run away. It should have been me. I hope you can see. I wish I was there with you tonight. Right up till the end, we were more than friends. On and off, we would walk in the same shoes. If I come home again, will we still pretend that you and I are the same that we used to? I heard you found a new friend who's an old good friend of mine. My heart, it beats like a drum. Let it drum just to numb my mind. It should have been me. I hope you can see. I wish I was there with you tonight, but I should let go a long time ago. But I just keep going back in time. Now that it's all too late, I shouldn't have run away. It should have been me. I hope you can see. I wish I was there with you tonight. You hurt me, I hurt you too. We just aren't the same as we used to. I'm gone now, and you're doing fine. But how do I get you off my mind? I hope you can see. I wish I was there with you tonight, but I should have come a long time ago. But I just keep going back in time. Now that it's all too late, I shouldn't have run away. It should have been me. I hope you can see. I wish I was there with you tonight. In the last minute, stop the clock and try to wake up. Behind your eyelids, a dream was lost, lost again. In the last minute, I told you everything I wanted to. And now you follow me and I follow you back home. So hold me again, that is all that I ask of you. You understand me more than I'll ever do. So restart this moment, it's all secondary thoughts. And I feel you're the only one. So I guess you are. In the last minute, stop the clock and try to wake up. behind your eyelids, a dream was lost, lost again. In the last minute, I told you everything I wanted to. And now you follow me and I follow you back home. So hold me again, that is all that I ask of you. You understand me more than I'll ever do. So restart this moment, it's all secondary thoughts. And I feel you're the only one. So I guess you are.
I am always by your side. Been years ago since we met that very first time, and still you blow my mind, the girl that cheer me up. You know that I still can't get enough. There's no fuss and fight, you make my life so easy. I can't believe you're mine, I know you'll never leave my side, no. 'Cause even when you're getting dressed, half asleep, your hair's a mess. Without makeup, still the best. Girl, you're different from the rest. People say that you're divine, something that they call divine, but you wouldn't even care at all. That's why you're beautiful. That's why you're beautiful. That's why you're beautiful. That's why you're beautiful. Got no need to show it all. 'Cause you're so real. People whisper and they stop, and you still blow my mind, girl, to cheer me up. Yeah, but what's the deal? Girl, I still can't get enough, no. There's no fuss and fight, you make my life so easy. I can't believe you're mine, I know you'll never leave my side, no. Getting dressed, half asleep, your hair's a mess. Without makeup, still the best. Girl, you're different from the rest. People say that you're divine, something that they call divine, but you wouldn't even care at all. That's why you're beautiful. That's why you're beautiful. That's why you're beautiful. That's why you're beautiful. You're beautiful. Tonight, we will celebrate our love and our life. We'll be together, you and I. We will watch the sunrise far across the ocean. Oh, even when you're getting dressed, half asleep, your hair's a mess. Without makeup, still the best. Girl, you're different from the rest. People say that you're divine, something that they
Silent music and shimmering gold, the strangest feeling about to explode. I held my breath to make sure I didn't say something weird. Light as a feather on weekend knees. What on earth did you do to me? I let you in before I even knew who you were. Your hair was just so golden, 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 and your eyes were also golden, 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 golden. All my dreams are now golden, 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 golden. I wonder where did you go? I have to know. Golden. A mirror image of my soul. I could see myself, but without the holes. I pinched my arm just to see if you could feel what I feel. We found each other right from the start. A conversation between our hearts. I wanted more, but it was hard to get through your shield. Your hair was just so golden, 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 and your eyes were also golden, 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 golden. All my dreams are now golden, 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 golden. I wonder where did you go? I have to know. Golden. Maybe I am wrong, and it's only me, and you didn't feel a thing. But I can't let you go when you're still painting images so deep within my mind, and every night in the shadows of my sleep. I cannot say I love you, I don't know you that well. At least let me find you so you can break this spell. Your hair was just so golden, 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 and your eyes were also golden, 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 golden. All my dreams are now golden, 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 golden. I wonder where did you go? I have to know. Golden, 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 and your eyes were also golden, 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 golden. I wonder where did you go? I have to know.
I think I know you from before, and I've been thinking about you. Stuck in my mind, and I want more. No, we got a thing going on. Walked up and kissed me on the spot. I'm still thinking about it. I really miss it quite a lot, and I try to see things about you that could make me change my way. I cannot find a thing I'm into you. You say whatever you want to. You go wherever you need to. So many reasons loving you. Yeah, girl, you're amazing. You know your way around feelings. Upfront, but not about hurting. So many reasons loving you. Yeah, girl, you're amazing. Amazing, that's you. Girl, you're amazing. It's true. This way you have, the way you move. There's nothing more you could improve. In every flaw I see the good, but my mind's a bit clouded. You're way too perfect to be true, and I try to see things about you
let's take it slow. There's no need to rush things, no. Let's figure out a way. You know it's you and me. Don't care what I say. So please don't go away, don't leave. Without you, boy, I cannot breathe. Let's figure out a way. You know it's you and me. Don't care what I say. It brings me down to fall apart. Thinking about the day you leave, it breaks my heart. Don't leave me hanging, baby. Don't leave me hanging, baby. I will never win this game. I am lost, boy, I'm in vain. I will never be the same. 'Cause I am lost, boy, I'm in vain. You are so beautiful. I'm losing well without you I fall. Let's figure out a way. You know it's you and me. Don't care what others say. Brings me down to fall apart. Thinking about the day you leave, it breaks my heart. Don't leave me hanging, baby. Don't leave me hanging, baby. I will never win this game. I am lost, boy, I'm in vain. I will never be the same. 'Cause I am lost, boy, I'm in vain. I will never win this game. No. I am lost, boy, I'm in vain. I will never be the same. 'Cause I am lost, boy, I'm in vain. Nothing really matters if you're not mine right here, right now. And even if the world ends, then I'll be fine. No fear, no doubt. I know a place that sneak away. Leave the pain, I'll stay with you. Let me hold you, close your eyes. We'll be reaching paradise. I don't even really know your name.
your eyes, we'll be reaching paradise. Ooh, 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 ooh. I don't even really know your name, but I'm still high on our love and making me feel alright. I don't even really know your name, but I'm still high on our love and making me feel alright. Yeah, I'm still high on our love and making me feel alright. I don't even really know your name, but I'm still high on our love and making me feel alright. Be alright, yeah, I know we'll be alright. We are closing in on heaven, and I know we'll be alright. Be alright, yeah, I know we'll be alright. We are closer now than ever, and I know we'll be alright. Be alright, yeah, I know we'll be alright. We are closer now than ever, and I know we'll be alright. Be alright, yeah, I know we'll be alright. We are closer now than ever, and I know we'll be alright. I don't even really know your name, but I'm still high on our love and making me feel alright. I don't even really know your name, but I'm still high on our love and making me feel alright.
There's something about the way he talks to me, how he talks to me now. The glimmer in his eyes as he's watching me, you know I'm watching him now. As he laughs with his beautiful smile, I know I'll never survive without this stranger by my side. The way he talks to me, the way he talks to me now. Life can sometimes feel like it's only dragging you down, dragging you down. Just remember you will always rise. Let your body go and don't think twice. If you meet a stranger with the deepest eyes, come on, 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 come on. Something in the way she looks at him, the way she looks at him now. A sadness in her eyes as she waves at him. She waves at him now. Tries to act as his beautiful wife. I know she'll never survive. If I leave, she will be alright. The way he talks to me, oh how he talks to me now. Life can sometimes feel like it's only dragging you down, dragging you down. Just remember you will always rise. Let your body go and don't think twice. If you meet a stranger with the deepest eyes, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Life can sometimes feel like it's only dragging you down, dragging you down. Just remember you will always rise. Let your body go and don't think twice. If you meet a stranger with the deepest eyes, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. hear thunder, I hear lightning, I hear wonders, and everybody wanna go, but no one really cares to know. I see marvels, I see titans, and some troubles that everybody has to face, that no one really can erase, and they hide away from it. A part of you is always standing in the rain, but I was never your ball and chain. A part of me was always trying to believe you were the only air to breathe. I stood against the wind, you hurt me, I'll find love again. Even as a friend, everything must end. When you worry, I worry. It's no hurry, 'cause we got all the time we need. If we're in love, then we'll succeed. I heard laughter, I heard music. I thought, baby, there's no way we could ever lose it. There's no way we could ever break or bruise it. But you threw it on the ground. A part of you is always standing in the rain, but I was never your ball and chain. A part of me was always trying to believe you were the only air to breathe. I stood against the wind, you hurt me, I'll find love again. Even as a friend, everything must end. Everything must end. I heard laughter, I heard music. I thought, baby, there's no way we could ever lose it. There's no way we could ever break or bruise it. A part of you is always standing in the rain, but I was never your ball and chain. A part of me was always trying to believe you were the only air to breathe. I stood against the wind, you hurt me, I'll find love again. Even as a friend, everything must end.
You were tall, I looked up. From where I sat, wished I would've dressed up. Your first line, won't forget. So is it true, no one's taking you yet? I remember people staring as we stepped outside. They had only one goal, get me off of your mind. I was no good, they said. You could do much better, but you gave them one middle finger and the door shut. 'Cause I know we are real as can be. Although we stick to each other, we're free. We still dream of what we could be. You still amaze me. Us lasting longer than them, standing stronger than them, letting think we are crazy. 'Cause I know we are real as can be. You still amaze me. Now that we've come so far, they're going nuts about how happy we are. See the bond that we made, it all seems real now that I'm not afraid. And we really got them, yeah, we sure did write it out. 'Cause we have each other, that's what it's all about. I was no good, they said. You could do much better, but you gave them one
driving all night long to the place where I belong, back to where I started from, the only place that I call home. 17 around the bend, drinking with my old best friend, listening to the radio. I thought we'd stay until the end. It wasn't always right, but it wasn't all that bad. This was all we had. And when I see it now, I always feel so free. I guess this town's still a big part of me. That's the spot where I got caught, running from the cops. I thought they would have changed the name by now, the owner someone else anyhow. That's where I saw Jenny first. Then I think I almost burst. I heard that she's a doctor now. She got out of this place somehow. Oh, it wasn't always right, but it wasn't all that bad. This was all we had. When I see it now, I always feel so free. I guess this town's still a big part of me. I wish I could have seen this all with you, but you're out somewhere else, and there's nothing I could do about it now. It wasn't always right, but it wasn't all that bad. This was all we had. When I see it now, I always feel so free. I guess this town's still a big part of me. It wasn't always right, but it wasn't all that bad. This was all we had. When I see it now, I always feel so free. I guess this town's still a big part of me. I guess this town's still a big part of me. I guess this town's still a big part of me.
I've been sitting around in my lonely room, waiting till we're alone, only me and you. And I'm counting down the seconds, but it feels like time runs slower now. Whoa, but in my fantasy world, you're already here with me. Baby, you rock me hard whenever I hear you call. I'm coming to you, 'cause I just can't get enough of it. No, feel like I lose my mind whenever I hear you say you're loving it too, 'cause I just can't get enough of it. No, I just can't get enough. Stop for a minute and hold it, don't let it pass. It's so hard to get out of this wonderland. Yeah, and I'm struggling not to lose control and head on further down the road. Yeah, we should get it right now, for it's all too late for me. Baby, you rock me time's running out of me. Hey, time's running out of me. Yeah, time's running out of me. Yeah, yeah. Oh, baby, you fuck me hard whenever I hear you call. I'm coming to you, 'cause I just can't get enough of it. I just can't get enough. Feel like I lose my mind whenever I hear you say you're loving it too. 'Cause I just can't get enough of it. Oh no, no, I just can't get enough. Hey, oh yeah. Hey, no, I just can't get enough.
I heard that you walked out again. I heard that you cried. Come this way, let me be a friend. My home's open wide. We can live here. We can die. There's nothing to fear if you try. If you keep believing, like rain falling soft from the sky, I'll tend to your needs. We can live here. We can die. We can live here. We can die. Oh, oh, so bright and awake. My heart levitates. Oh, oh, so bright and awake. My heart levitates. Oh, oh, so bright and awake. My heart levitates. Oh, oh, so bright and awake. My heart levitates. We can live here. We can die. We can live here. We can die.
I know I'm not the only. I close my eyes at times. I'll do it when the sky falls. Forget about the crimes. If I could stay forever,
I can't leave without you. No reason to deny that we've gotta try again. Can we make it to the other side? While we figure out this life, you will learn how to love again. I promise and I know that I will make you
Where have you gone? I'm missing you lately. You're sitting right there, but so far away. Where do we go? Nobody knows. We'll have to see how this story goes. 'Cause I've been looking for forgiveness. I try to be the best I can. I wanna wake you up in the middle of the night. I wanna stay right here for the rest of my life. So I keep on believing the hurting is gone. I know I'm right where I belong. Hey, what about you? Straight from the heart, I'll always be waiting right here for you to come along and give me strength to carry on. We keep waiting for tomorrow, trying to find a better way. I wanna wake you up in the middle of the night. I wanna stay right here for the rest of my life. So I keep on believing the hurting is gone. I know I'm right where I belong. Hey, what about you? I know we can get lost sometimes, but I'm always coming back to you. Wake you up in the middle of the night. Wake you up in the middle of the night. I wanna wake you up in the middle of the night. I wanna stay right here for the rest of my life. So I keep on believing the hurting is gone. I know we're right where we belong. Hey, what about you? I wanna wake you up in the middle of the night. Oh, I wanna stay right here for the rest of my life. Oh, so I keep on believing the hurting is gone. I know we're right where we belong. Hey, what about you?
Young love, what are we missing here? I reach out if you talk to me, yeah. Deep down, you know what you mean to me. Can't find the right words to say it, but our story goes deeper than this. Whatever happens, it's you that I miss. Open up your guard and let me love you. I just wanna hold you. You're my favorite mistake. Lay your head down and stay beside me, the only place that we need. 'Cause I'm staying right here with you. I know that we're more than two worlds apart, but I need what you're giving me, yeah. Somehow we have to figure it out now. The right way to show it. But our story goes deeper than this. Whatever happens, it's you that I miss. Open up your guard and let me love you.
working out the ways that you'll always be right. Light, can it wait? If we fell apart, would you want me to stay? Why do we always start to come back together right when we fall? Fade out, heavenly tangerine. Drain out, won't you come back to me? If it breaks down, you'll still be right for me. I could ease your mind. I know that you always got to be right. Light, it can't wait. I don't care if you think it's too late, we still got time. Why do we always start to come back together right when we fall? Fade out, heavenly tangerine. Dry now, won't you come back to me? And even if it ends, would you turn your back on me? Can we forget the past and start over? Fade out, heavenly tangerine. Fade out, heavenly tangerine. Dry now, won't you come back to me? Fade out, heavenly tangerine. And if it breaks down, you'll still be right for me. If it breaks down, you'll still be right for me.
If I could see you again, I don't know where to start. I've tried to fix every wound with this lone heart. I'd see that siren smile while I'd find a way to breathe. But the way that your eyes shatter mine, I will be defeated. But if I'd go back, I could turn away. But if I leave it, I couldn't let me. If I go back, I could turn away. But I would turn back, I'm bound to relapse. I wish I'd see you again, but I don't know where I start. You're so hard to detach, though I know I should let go. I surrender. I just can't surrender. I just can't surrender. I just can't surrender. I just can't surrender.
Captured in a photograph. Remember how we used to sit in the vines? Yeah, oh. And I can hear you laugh it off. You always said mistakes I left in the past. But no, I know enough to see the blow on us we're over. Sooner than we're gone. And sometimes I think about it all night, staring to the streetlights, wonder where we'd be if nothing would have changed. If we'd have stayed the same, never killed the flame, would we hold our ground? If nothing would have changed, would you take my name, stay here through the rain? Would we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? Drawing from another time, the walls of paint that spells out your name. Yeah. You said you had to change your heart, that Albany just left you all the same. I could see enough to know you're better off, but sometimes it hits you when it's gone. And all night I stare into that same light, reinventing our life. I wonder where we'd be if nothing would have changed. If we'd have stayed the same, never killed the flame, would we hold our ground? If nothing would have changed, would you take my name, stay here through the rain? Would we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? One and on the other side, parallel to our life, dreaming of a place to hide and find you in another time. Up it comes and down it goes, seeds will die before they grow. If nothing would have changed, if we'd have stayed the same, never killed the flame, would we hold our ground? If nothing would have changed, would you take my name, stay here through the rain? Would we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? Captured in a photograph. Do you remember how we used to sit in the vines?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. since we hung out. Party every weekend out and about. Then we had no cares, we had no doubt. Staying up all night and playing music loud. I look back, these were the days. We were in a happy, happy place. In all the years since we hung out, you took off and left this town. Suddenly you're here. An eternity since we were together. Can't believe you're here. And I'm falling in love again. But baby, you're the same girl as you used to be. Love the way your eyes shine bright at me. You're the very same girl, look at that smile. Though I haven't seen you for a while. Got the fortune and the fame. Everyone around you knows your name. Always gonna be. Always gonna be. Same old girl to me. Be the same old girl to me. With the success, who could ever guess? You would move to Hollywood, become the best. Want to be a queen on the silver screen. Probably the cutest girl I ever seen. I look back, these were the days. We were in a happy, happy place. In all the years since we hung out, you took off and left this town. But baby, you're the same girl as you used to be. Love the way your eyes shine bright at me. You're the very same girl, look at that smile. Though I haven't seen you for a while. Got the fortune and the fame. Everyone around you knows your name. Always gonna be. Always gonna be. Same old girl to me. Hey. Be the same old girl to me. Me. Dim the lights and move up close. I guess that's how a story goes. I never thought I'd get the chance to kiss your lips and slowly dance. Your hands are wrapped around my neck, and I know it's not an act. We're sharing all the memories, and I know they're bad. But baby, you're the same girl as you used to be. Love the way your eyes shine bright at me. You're the very same girl, look at that smile. So I haven't seen you for a while. Well, baby, the fortune and the fame. Everyone around you knows your name. Always gonna be. Always gonna be the same old girl. Baby, you're the same girl as you used to be. Love the way your eyes shine bright at me. You're the very same girl, look at that smile. Though I haven't seen you for a while. Got the fortune and the fame. Everyone around you knows your name. Always gonna be, baby, the same old girl to me. Oh yeah, the same old girl to me. Oh, be the same old girl to me. Hey, don't you think I can see that you've been looking at me, that you've been staring at my face? Hey baby, I don't wanna stay in this club no longer. You can move on to my place. There's no need to be shy, cause you found a right guy. I will take you up high the whole night. Hey baby, don't be afraid, you just follow my way. Tonight we will fight together. We will rock it tonight. Just jump on this fight. We will rock it tonight. Just jump on this fight together. We will rock it tonight and forever. Just jump on this fight together. We will rock it tonight and forever. Just jump on this fight together. We will rock it high. We're burning like a fire. Yes, we're moving to the top. Baby, we got the power. Keep on like this for hours. Moving on like this non-stop. Baby, don't be afraid. You just follow my way. Tonight we will fight together. We will rock it tonight and forever. Just jump on this fight together. We will rock it tonight and forever. Just jump on this fight together. it up high, we will rock it all night. Girl, you're looking so fine, we will make it alright. We will take it up high, we will rock it all night. Girl, you're looking so fine, we will make it alright. We will rock it tonight. Just jump on this flight. We will rock it tonight. Just jump on this flight, fly together. We will rock it tonight and forever. Just jump on this flight, fly together. We will rock it tonight and forever. Just jump on this flight, fly together. We sing hey oh, we sing hey oh, we sing hey oh, we sing hey oh.
When I feel worn out, tired and alone, and every minute passes into the unknown, you bring me comfort like nobody can. I hear you whisper, life has only just begun. So I hold out hope to be stronger than forever when it's you and me together. 'Cause I never lost my faith in you. Every time when I felt you would pull me through. Yes, I never lost my faith in you. Oh, I never lost my faith in you. When I feel broken from every little wound, you remind me, oh, that we are not consumed. There will be moments when I'm drifting away into the darkness, but you will lead the way. So I hold out hope to be stronger than forever when it's you and me together. 'Cause I never lost my faith in you. Every time when I felt you would pull me through. Yes, I never lost my faith in you. Oh, I never lost my faith in you. I never lost my faith in you. Oh, I never lost my faith in you. by the lake, you were chasing your dream. And I gave you a rose that you kept on seeing, kept on seeing. I've been feeling stuck here lately. Think I might be going crazy. Your song on repeat on my radio. Now you've been away for so long, and I've been fighting feelings so strong. Your song on repeat on my radio. I need to get out. You're all I think about. My head in the clouds. With you I was bouncing off the walls, but now I'm on the floor. Or did you let me go? I want something new, because everywhere I look here I see you. A new point of view of the memories and all the things we used to do. Now I hate your favorite movie. Can't believe you did that to me. Your song on repeat on my radio. I need to get out. You're all I think about. My head in the clouds. With you I was bouncing off the walls, but now I'm on the floor. Or did you let me go? I want something new. I want something new, because everywhere I look here I see you. A new point of view of the memories and all the things we used to do. Shouting from the rooftops every time your beat drops. Always on repeat like. Shouting from the rooftops every time your beat drops. Always on repeat like.
I'm placing my apology underneath the Christmas tree, and I hope you know what I'm trying to show. Your love is all I want in return. For all the times I made you cry, I look at you and wonder why. Did I hurt you so? Can you let it go? I know this time I'll make it alright. I'm on my way to your place. The snow is falling down. Ooh, oh, oh, oh. image from a dream kept me up all night. The feeling is surreal, stuck inside my mind. Your body in my arms, under moonlit skies. We're trying to count the stars till the sun will rise. I don't wanna wait, travel far away. If we leave today, will you tag along? Come on, tag along. Come on, tag along. Sand, footprints on the beach, so closely hand in hand till we're out of reach. Ain't going by the clock like we're frozen time. Your kisses are so hard and your eyes, they shine. I don't wanna wait, travel far away. If we leave today, will you tag along? Come on, tag along. Come on, tag along. Come on, tag along. Never give up. One day you'll be mine and we'll take off. Follow me, I could be all you ever wanted and more. What is mine is yours. I don't wanna wait, travel far away. If we leave today, will you tag along? Come on, tag along, tag along, tag along. Ooh, come on, tag along. Yeah, yeah.
Hey, if we only could talk just a little, find a place where the past is forgiven. You moved on, I am stuck in the middle. Tried to run, but there's nowhere to go. Even in my sleep, I'm calling out your name. But I never wanted things to be this way, this way. Smell your hair for a second, just like I used to do, girl, what happened? In my dreams, all I see is the caption. Tried to run, but there's nowhere to go. Even in my sleep, I'm calling out your name. But I never wanted things to be this way, this way. so damn hard to forget you. And no words could explain how I miss you. Girl, I do. I'm trying to keep up with my ex. I don't admit I want you back. No matter what I say, still you know I do miss you. I'm trying to keep up with my ex. I don't admit I want you back. No matter what I say, still you know I do miss you. 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 Hey, hey. 'Cause baby I miss you. I swear that I miss you.
I'm waiting for you. No, I won't leave you. You've been down so long that I can barely breathe. In a sea of worry, waiting for a flurry. All water reaching for the sky. I thought that I could be without you. I thought I'd let you go and drop you. I thought that I could just pretend that I didn't miss you. But now it's plain for me to see. Hey, you're my only remedy. Won't you please come back to me? And I swear that I will never leave again. Hey, tell you what you mean to me. I was crazy to believe that I could live another day, making you my history. I'm begging of you, and the gods above you, that no matter what, you're gonna be alright. You've seen the bottom, stars fell and I caught 'em. Now I'm just holding back my tears. I thought that I could be without you. I thought I'd let you go and drop you. I thought that I could just pretend that I didn't miss you. But now it's plain for me to see. Hey, you're my only remedy. Won't you please come back to me? And I swear that I will never leave again. Hey, tell you what you mean to me. I was crazy to believe that I could live another day, making you my history. You're more than the mirror for my love. You're everything I'm dreaming of. I thought that I could be without you. I thought I'd let you go and drop you. I thought that I could just pretend that I didn't miss you. But now it's plain for me to see. Hey, you're my only remedy. Won't you please come back to me? And I swear that I will never leave again. Hey, tell you what you need of me. I was crazy to believe that I could live another day, making you my history.
strong.